Genesis chapter 1 through 1, verse 1 to 2. 1, 2. In the beginning, God created in the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters.
There's a story that goes about two men. And these men like to go to the coffee shop every morning and have their daily coffee. The one man was a preacher. The other man's first name was Dave, or David. And they did this for a long period of time and never spoke to each other. And then one day, they decided to sit down together and introduce each other. And as conversations go, they started talking about what their work was and their profession. And of course, when the preacher said what he did, that really grabbed the attention of the one man. Well, that starts the conversation. And it goes like this. So David states in a concerned way, "Preacher, I am concerned about the environment. Isn't God concerned too?" Well, the preacher answered. He said in Genesis 1:1, as we just read, God created the heavens and the earth. And so we see that God created. We also see in Genesis chapter 1, verses 29 through 30, God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed. It shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth, which has life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And so we see that God had supplied what the earth has. Vegetation, animals, whatever it is that we see, God says, I made that. I created that. We even see that with Abram in Genesis 12:7, that land was an important thing. He told Abram to pull up your roots. And he says, I want you to travel to a place that I'm going to prepare for you. All you got to do is take it. It's a land of milk and honey. And Abram did it, later to be called Abraham. But David says, but many of us have heard the Genesis account of creation. But what is he doing with it? Well, first, the first account of God using nature to punish, we find in Genesis 3, verse 17 through 19, that God says, he says, you shall not eat of the fruit of this. He said, cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you. And you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. We also see that God used a second time in history the creation to punish. In Genesis 4, in verses 10 through 12, he says, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood that you have spent with your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. You shall be a vagrant and a wanderer on earth." And Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear." And we see a third account of God using nature to punish in Genesis 6, verses 11 through 12. He says, "Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, and all the flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth." And then skipping to verse 16, it says, "You shall make a window for the ark and finish it to a cubit. And you shall make it with lower and second and third decks. And behold, I, even I, bring the flood of water upon the earth." We see that God used nature to begin with to punish those who were unfaithful. Adam and Eve were unfaithful. Cain was unfaithful. We see that all humanity had become unfaithful, except for one single family. And so God says, "I'm going to take nature and punish you, because that you understand. You understand storms. You understand famine. You understand pain. When I can't reach you with words, I'll reach you physically with pain and discipline." And that is how God says that he handled man to begin with, to get their attention. There's a recording of Joshua, even in chapter 10, that Brother Josh Bowman is teaching. Bolin. I know a Bowman too, that's my problem. In Sunday morning classes, but in chapter 10, it's interesting in this case, starting in verse 11, "And it came about as they fled from Israel," this is during a battle, that Israel was to take their own land that God promised them. It says that God threw large stones from heaven, and those who were hit by the hail of stones were killed more than the sword that Israel used. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in that day, and the Lord delivered up to the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, "O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Ajalon." So the sun stood still and the moon stopped, until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jashar that the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day? So here we see that God used creation again to punish those who had done evil. Who else can do this kind of powerful thing? Well, David says, "You're using a lot of Bible. How can I know what you're telling me is true?" Well, the preacher replies, "The Bible may be the oldest book we possess. There are no other books that have been able to mirror or to exceed its greatness. It is accurate in history, in science, in wars, the lives of people, most certain Jesus himself being explained, moral accuracy, reason reasoning and finding a perfect life. And okay, David says, I hear you. But how can he control such a mammoth thing as our environment? Well, in Genesis 18:4, God said, is there anything too difficult for the Lord? He also explained in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 4, for every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Yeah, but many believe we came in existence by a big bang. What do you think about that, preacher? Well, the preacher says, I'd like to quote a man that I'd heard say this one time. He says, how could mindless rocks, dirt, gas, and slime bring about the amazingly complex designs we see in this world? But the world seems to be evolving and changing. Man is healthier than they ever have been. Well, the preacher replied again by quoting another preacher, but Brother Bert Thompson has a degree in microbiology. He was studied and wrote many years on the Bible and science. And Bert had this to say, give a man a false, warped view of his origin, and he will likewise possess a false, warped view of his destiny. Have you ever studied in science in class in high school or in college? The human body, our immune system, our stomach, white corpuscles, red corpuscles, all of this that is about us, our physical being. He says, we haven't changed. If you go over the years, centuries, thousands of years, our bodies haven't changed. We still operate the same way we've been created. Now, do we eat differently? Have we educated ourselves a little more? Maybe. There were some pretty smart people back then. But basically, we have not changed. He says also, if you remember when we talked about in the book of Genesis in the beginning, many of those men were living over 100 years. Some were living into the 900 years before they passed away. And so it's argumental whether we are in better health than they are when you consider things might have been a little different in nature than what they are now. But he says there's still that one question that is around. And that question is, do I believe in God? No matter what nature looks like, no matter what man has evolved to, there is the still plain and simple question that started in Genesis. Will I believe in God? When Adam and Eve were told not to take of the fruit, they didn't believe God. When Cain and Abel were to offer certain sacrifices, they didn't believe God. Cain changed it. When man started to become his own God and the world became evil, even in all of its thoughts, except for Noah and his family, they didn't believe God. When Moses struck the rock when he was told to speak to the rock, God says, you didn't believe me, and so you're not going to the promised land. That's a question we have today, has never changed. Do you believe God? Then what will you do with it? And the preacher touched a nerve with this man that was inquisitive about nature and the environment. And what are we going to do about it as human beings? The preacher asked David, when crops fail, when the gardens don't produce anymore, what do we do as human beings? When 9/11 happened, church attendances went up in the United States. Why? Because when everything goes down and it looks like the only thing I got is my body, I'm worried. And people start to pray. And people start going to church. But why do you pray to a God if he can't answer you? Why do you pray to a God if he can't change it? If he hasn't the power to do so? Why put your trust in something that is not trusting? David says, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. What we see in Matthew 6:11, in the model prayer that Jesus gave, he says, and give us this day our daily bread. God is saying, pray to me and ask me to give you food. He says, I have that power to do so. He even goes as far in the previous chapter in Matthew 5, in verse 45. He says, he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And so God says to David, the preacher says, God says, I have control of this. He says, you're not in control. You're begging for help. You're turning to me, and I'm telling you, I have control of this. I have control of the environment. I can send the rain, or I can withhold the rain. He says another thing that you may want to look up. He says, if you look into history, he says, look at the Middle East. If you go back maybe in the 1000 BC or 1500 BC, maybe even further, but it's hard to get historical evidences of some of the environmental places that it talks about. But when you look at the Middle East produced far more food back in those days, was far more green. Crops yielded well. Babylon had food to spare. And then the people did not believe God. And so God cursed the ground. And we look at the Middle East today, and what do we see? How often do you even see a tree? And if you see a tree like you see some pictures of Jerusalem today, you might see a tree that might be 10 feet tall, not 50 or 80 some feet. The trees of Lebanon that is talk about, the cedars, they say those were approximately 40 feet in diameter, 80 some feet tall. These were humongous trees, and there's none there. None to speak of. What happened? God says, I cursed the ground. I took from you, and I'm going to allow this ground to not produce. And you're going to suffer because you didn't believe me. Book of Isaiah talks about this. The book of Jeremiah. The minor prophets, when you look at all the minor prophets, all of them are talking about the warnings of God to people of what he will do to us if we don't turn from false gods and start to obey and believe in God Jehovah. All those books are written about it. In fact, over half of the Old Testament is written about 900 BC to when Jesus comes. Much of that history is covered in that. And so David thought about that. And he says, "Preacher, I'm hearing you." He says, "You're pricking my heart. I don't know what to do with all this." He says, "Sounds reasonable, but I'm not sure what to do with this yet." But the preacher wasn't done. He says, "But I have the unexcused answer for you." He says in Romans chapter 1, he says, God is evident within all of those. And he is talking about those who don't believe in God and who are practicing promiscuous lifestyle. They're sinning. And God says, I am evident within them. God made it evident to them. Now, how does God make it evident that there is a God to every human being? How does he do that? Verse 20 then starts, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." Now, an attribute is something that belongs to somebody. It's something you own. It is your quality. It is your character. It's your personality. And he says the invisible attributes are clearly seen. You couldn't help but walk in this building and say, somebody worked on the inside of this building. That's organized. This is organized. This is organized. That's organized. These pews show organization. If there's organization, folks, what? There is an organizer. It screams at you. He says, that's what, though he is invisible, you see my attributes. Is he a loving God? Is he a kind God? Does he look after those that are his? These are the things of his nature. God's nature. His character. He is a good and loving God who is long-suffering, but he is also a just God. We see these things in nature. They are repetitious. We practice copying these things. For example, he says, look at the birds. Birds to get their uptake with their wings. But they have also tail feathers. What's the tail feather supposed to do? And he talks to them about how we have duplicated how birds fly by making airplanes, and even making airplanes better. How we build buildings, how we do math, do this, that, how we farm. All these things we have looked at nature and says, that's the way to do it. We are looking at high-tech things, and we're thinking, oh, we're getting really smart. Do you know that they're looking at high-tech now as maybe placing things in animals and trying to control animals? They've been practicing this since the 50s, and they have had success with this. Things aren't so high-tech. He also brings out in Acts, makes this fact that God does not apologize for. In Acts chapter 14, he says, God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. And in the generations gone by, he permitted all the nations to go their own way. And yet he did not leave himself without witnesses, in that he did good and gave you rains, and from heaven fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. God says, that's my witness that there's my presence. Is I gave you life. Well, Day says, you have certainly given me more to think about. And the preacher says, designed people should know there is a designer. God is waiting for your decision, David. And that sort of ended the conversation. And this conversation goes on tens of times. People who sort of believe but don't believe. Because to believe there's a God means I have to take a seat down the road. I am my own God. That's what some people feel. All you have to do is look at the history of the Old Testament. We are our own enemies. We turn on ourselves. We think we're so smart. And yet God says, I'm giving you a witness of myself. You know these principles are true because you copy them, and that's how you built things. So you know it all works. Nobody gave you that. You looked at what I was doing, God says. So what are you doing today? What has God told you to do with your life? Are you practicing it? Is your purity better than what it used to be? Is your knowledge growing? Is your faith stronger? Are you evolving as a Christian? Well, we all came today because we wanted to get stronger as Christians, didn't we? We wanted to worship the only true and living God. And we acknowledge that by our presence and by our worship of words and activity towards him. There are still those who are going to leave the coffee shops, and they're going to have this new information, but they won't respond. That is not what a Christian does. Christians know what's expected of us from God. And we also know we're not perfect. And we also know that God is not going to ask us something we cannot do as an individual. Salvation was a very big word. And I am convinced of a lot of things on Judgment Day that are going to become evident to us. And one of them is going to be the value of your salvation. When we see people being parted to the left and we get to go to the right because the blood of Christ is so powerful, it covers our sins, and we were found faithful until death. I think there's a lot of things that are going to make sense. More than I possibly comprehend that I can even share. There's so many things I don't even understand. That's not saying much. I'm just trying to say, folks, when you step from this world of physical needs to a world, the presence of God is all we need, and we have a different body, it's hard to fathom this. Who's in control of the environment? God makes the claim without apologizing. God says, I am. Are we to care for our environment? Yes, we are. Look at Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Man and woman are supposed to care for things. They're supposed to be stewards. We are to do those things. But folks, we haven't and never will, I'm confident of that, learn how to make it rain. Make it sunny, more sunny. Make the sun shut off. God is the only one that can stop the sun and stop the moon, stop the rain, or give it back. God's the only one that the Bible speaks of. Do you believe that? Well, your actions will prove it. If there's somebody this morning that has been thinking about God, would like to look at this in a closer way, we are here not to just talk, we're here to try and help. There may be somebody who would like to come forward and talk right now about who Jesus is, and what's that got to do with me? Maybe you're not done with your cup of coffee and you'd like to talk some more about it. That's what we're here for. If we can help in any way, please come forward as we stand.